Hello there, friends. Welcome to another episode of Brown Bags and Bibles. Scott Wakefield, lead pastor at First Christian Church of Greene County, Tennessee, joined by
Mark Liebert. I'm one of the elders here serving with Scott.
And we are in week 1000 of our mini episodes series on Christianity and new religious movements.
But it is winding down.
'Tis. And it's winding down with uncommitted new religious movements.
Yeah. So again, we're using Dr. Derek Cooper's book, Christianity and New Religious Movements. This is his last section, Uncommitted.
Yes.
And there are two in this that he covers, atheism and none, people who claim nothing. But today we're looking at atheism.
I'm already holding back jokes about the illogic going on. So atheism is the story of unbelief.
Right.
We've been talking about lots of things that have been beliefs. They say things, et cetera, from India, China, Middle East.
Right.
We've also talked about some cultic and sects and these new religious movements and traditions are what they are. Some of them are growing, some of them are dying. This is one that, along with nuns especially, that is growing quite a bit right now.
Yeah, we need to understand this and be able to articulate our beliefs and know how to interact with them.
Yeah, for sure. So
let's talk about atheists in general. So the Pew Research Center is just a helpful website you can go to. It says 8 facts about atheists. Well, one of these facts is before there are 8 facts is that atheists make up 4% of U.S. adults. So I guess that's about 10 million people.
Yeah, and I'm sure that's people who would call themselves that,
right,
and purport that they are one of those.
That's right.
So they're probably more functionally.
Yeah, so the 8 facts from the Pew Research Center. In the U.S., atheists are mostly men and are relatively young.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. Almost all, 98% of atheists in the U.S. say religion is not all or not too important, not at all or not too important in their lives.
And you may think, well, of course not, they're atheists. But actually, there's a difference between saying you're an atheist versus you have nothing to do with religion.
Right.
There are people who are atheists who are in religion.
Yes.
We'll get to that. U.S. 8.3, U.S. atheists and religiously affiliated Americans find meaning in their lives in some of the same ways. Interesting that we have common ways we find meaning.
And we Christians would say
they're borrowing from a Christian
us.
worldview. Yes. That's right. That's what we would say.
We just did. Number 4, atheists make up a larger share of the population in many Western European countries than in the U.S.
Yeah.
And we are more like post-Christian continental Europe and Western European countries.
We're headed that way.
We're definitely headed that way.
That's right.
Yeah.
Number 5, most U.S. atheists express concerns, and we'll talk about this, about the role religion plays in society.
It's a danger.
Yeah. This is one of the reasons this is lumped into a religious movement is because a number of them have very strong feelings about religion and Christianity.
Yeah. Which one might say is a belief.
Number 6.
Sorry. I keep going back to all those things I'm trying to not say. Hold back, Scott. So number 6, you said, atheists may not believe religious teachings, but they usually are, and this is true, quite informed about religion.
Oh, yeah. They'll engage you in conversation.
And many of them have gotten to where they get because they've thought about and studied some of these things.
Yep.
Yeah.
Number 7, most Americans don't think believing in God is necessary to be a good person. And that's not just atheists.
Right.
That's Americans.
Yeah. On average. Most.
Yeah.
And then finally, 77% of U.S. atheists do not believe in God or a higher power or in a spiritual force of any kind.
Yeah. All right, so that was
all
from
believe that love comes from, matter.
Yeah, so that was from the Pew Research Center. So now we'll get into Dr. Cooper's book. We'll use his outline, his structure from here forward until we get to the end where we make commentary on a lot of the ways we can interact with atheists. So,
yep. In that vein, we've been talking about the beginning story, the creation story, which is a big deal for all of these forms of belief or supposed unbelief. So they would say, although atheism has existed for millennia,
Right.
Darwin's theories have caused religion to be greatly questioned.
Yeah. So in 1859, Darwin wrote On the Origin of the Species. It was an immediate bestseller.
Yeah.
So was his sequel. And effectively, Darwin's contribution here to science was his theory, I think you know this, but we'll just say it, his theory of evolution by natural selection. Dr. Cooper points out, he says, the effect of the Enlightenment, which started a couple centuries before that,
Yes.
coupled with Darwin's theory in the mid-1800s,
Yes.
all of that led many people to question the existence of God.
For sure. The Enlightenment was the intellectual and cultural milieu that meant that this did what it has done in our culture today. Yep. Evolution by natural selection, meaning within species, macro.
Macro, yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
So natural selection, but on a macro scale.
Yeah.
So in our day,
Yes, in our modern day,
yes, cloning, sequencing, the Human Genome Project, robotics, and AI have accelerated this idea.
Right.
And I would say a lot of the way, at least not real science, but a lot of the way popular or modern science has talked about things and purports to make claims for itself, it definitely has accelerated this atheism and created more to the Enlightenment cultural milieu.
yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
All right, so let's do a couple definitions because that's what Dr. Cooper does. I think it's helpful. He says, so atheism, he says it's actually hard to define atheism.
You'd think.
But generally, you can define it as the absence of belief in the existence of God or gods.
Or the belief in a non-God.
Right, or the belief in a non-God. And then agnosticism, which is closely related,
Yes.
is the belief that nothing is known or can be known about the existence or nature of God.
And both parties would definitely distinguish themselves.
Yes.
I am not an agnostic.
Right.
I am an agnostic and not an atheist.
Right.
Right. And the what can you know, it's an epistemological thing with agnostics. It's like, there's no way to know.
Right. Right.
And so some agnostics, well, yeah, we'll talk more about these kinds of things with atheism later on. But yeah, that's an important thing to distinguish, I think, at the beginning.
Yeah.
So historical origins, where did it come from?
Yeah, so very interesting. Atheism, the first recorded evidence of atheism in history was a charge leveled against Socrates. Not that he was an atheist,
Right.
but that was the charge leveled against him he lived 470 BC to 399 BC. So he was accused of being an atheist. That's the first recorded evidence of that idea being written about someone.
Yes. And it's important to always say those kinds of things in the context of first recorded evidence.
Right.
There are predecessors that we don't know about, most likely.
Yeah.
But the first that we know of. And so the Greeks at that time, and this is Greco-Roman, so it's a little pre-Roman.
Right.
This is BC.
Right.
Referred to the absence of belief in the gods, small g. Right. They understood that was a thing.
Right.
But it was very rare to admit that you actually believed there are no GODSs.
Right. It's just very rare.
Yeah.
Even though the concept existed. Plutarch came along in the first century AD, 46 AD to 119 AD. He wrote of atheists as generally people who had no belief in God and made it very clear that was a bad thing. And at the time, very much everyone would have agreed, oh, no, that's a very bad thing.
Yeah.
As opposed to today. It's not looked at that way, but that's how it was looked at then.
So early Christians, interestingly, were accused of being atheists.
Yeah, if you've never heard that before, you might stop and think, what?
Yeah.
But there's a reason.
Yeah, because they worshipped privately, especially given that they had to early on, and because they rejected the pantheon of small GODSs or paganism in all its forms.
Yeah, they rejected that.
Yeah, a monotheistic faith rejects all those.
Right, and they kept talking about this Jesus guy.
Yes, right.
So they were accused of being atheists.
Yep.
Yep. So until atheism became more popular, which began in the 1600s AD to become more popular, until then, effectively, if you didn't believe in God, you were also called an infidel.
Huh.
That was just a common term, infidels.
I've never
Those who didn't believe in God.
That. Yeah, interesting.
That's what Dr. Cooper points out.
Yeah. It is unknown as to whether Darwin was actually an atheist or not.
Yeah, it's you just can't tie him down on that.
Yeah, much less so than I think people assume.
Yeah. Likely agnostic, but we're not sure.
At least, if not, maybe recanted some
right.
toward the end of his life.
Right.
The term agnosticism was coined by Thomas Huxley in 1869 to define his own philosophy, and he was a friend of Darwin.
A big supporter of Darwin,
Yeah, and believer in science, skeptical of anything which had no scientific grounds, and he assumed that God falls into that category.
Yeah, you can read it. Dr. Cooper has an excerpt from his writing in the mid-1800s, and he basically says, I'm coming up with a new term for myself, and this is what it is. Because you claim to know something that can't be known. That's what he says.
Yeah, he is Darwin's bulldog.
Yep.
They called him.
Yeah. Good friend of Darwin.
Defender of the theory.
Yeah.
Yep.
Another name you might have heard of is Bertrand Russell, 1872 to 1970, lived almost 100 years. He explained agnostics, what they believe is that it's impossible to know whether or not there is a God.
Yeah, he was a very significant figure within philosophy.
Right.
Yeah.
And he was particularly opposed to religions like Christianity. He said they lack logical sense. So he was, again, what you're going to see is a progression from we don't know if God exists to religion is bad, Christianity is bad.
And we're seeing more militant,
militant.
anti anybody who believes in God. Yeah, nowadays. So worldviews of atheism and agnosticism. We will continue to move toward atheism, like we just said, but these may surprise people, but it's worth saying because it's important to understand how it's the same kind of idea and worldview and philosophy that results in the kinds of things that we have experienced, like communism.
Yes.
Communism is a worldview that's an outgrowth of atheism or agnosticism. Humanism, socialism, evolutionism, secularism, materialism, naturalism, all those isms.
Yeah. In fact, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in the 1800s, they said things like communism abolishes eternal truth.
It's interesting, yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, these worldviews are connected to atheism and agnosticism. All right, so let's talk about what Dr. Cooper calls modern atheism, and we don't mean today. By modern atheism, he means the 1500s to the 1800s.
I just used modern and I meant today, but
yeah.
This modern is not today.
Right.
So this is coming out of and a part of a lot of this
the
Enlightenment stuff we talked about earlier.
Yep.
It really came of age in the beginning of the 16th century, so in the 15-ish hundreds, but started to be well known with people like Voltaire, Hume, Paine. So Voltaire was 1694 to 1778.
French,
David Hume, Voltaire was French. David Hume is 1711 to 1778, wrote Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion in 1779. That is an important work. The Categorical Imperative, David Hume, philosopher. Actually, I think almost all of these are philosophers except for Darwin, and Thomas Paine is political philosopher. Thomas Paine wrote Age of Reason. That is an important text for sure. And he is 1737 to 1809. Darwin was Origin of Species, mentioned him before, 1859. Descent of Man in 71. And then Karl Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto in 1848 and Das Kapital in 1867 to 1883. And then Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche, 1844 to 1900, wrote The Antichrist, 1888.
Yeah, so the point that Dr. Cooper makes is these authors and their books made atheism, he said, intellectually and morally acceptable or respectable.
Right, yeah.
It's interesting.
That's a big deal.
Yeah.
It gave weight to them and meant people, when you read something in a book, you think, this person must know what they're talking about, obviously.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it gives weight to it. It gives credence to it. It provides a culture and a place for you to work out those kinds of ideas, and you're not the only one.
Yeah.
And especially in a context where you would have been, infidel.
Right.
You would have been an infidel.
Right. It was pejorative. It was negative to be an atheist.
Right.
But these made it more respectable.
Yeah.
Now, they're in contrast to what Dr. Cooper calls new atheism, which is basically the 20th and 21st centuries, what we're in now, the 1900s forward.
Yep.
And he says, and you've pointed this out too, today's atheists are more dogmatic in their support of science and their opposition to religion.
For sure. Yep.
But he points out many of these are educated white men who are 50s and older. But you know some of these names, so let's go through them and what they've done.
Stephen Hawking, Cambridge physicist, now dead, wrote A Brief History of Time in 1988 and The Grand Design in 2010, arguing for the creation of the cosmos independent of a creator. Richard Dawkins, Oxford professor, The God Delusion is one of his big books to debunk the concept of deity. He came up with the idea of memes. That comes from his biology work, which was actually that work was actually pretty important and significant and helpful. The rest, not so much. Daniel Dennett, American philosopher who wrote Darwin's Dangerous Idea and Breaking the Spell, Religion as a Natural Phenomenon, arguing that evolution accounts for all the morality. He is particularly virulent.
Not pleased with Christianity.
Yeah. And kind of the least... Well, okay. Just leave it all alone and move on, Scott.
Yeah.
Christopher Hitchens,
right?
Mark quickly said.
No, that's all right.
British journalist who wrote God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything, asserting that all religions are hateful and violent.
And that's why I was saying we're going to get more toward there's an agenda, not just to say we don't believe in God, but that religion is the problem.
Yes. Christopher Hitchens' brother is... pretty conservative evangelical
I didn't know that.
Yep. I believe it's David Hitchens.
Okay.
Sam Harris, an American neuroscientist who wrote The End of Faith and Letter to a Christian Nation, arguing that religion is the source of most human problems, particularly Islam.
Yeah. So you've probably heard of many, if not all, of these names. So those are the modern atheists.
And they are usually called the new atheists.
Right.
Yeah.
The new atheists. Yeah, the new atheists. Okay. All right, so now a category Dr. Cooper calls religious atheism.
Yeah.
So obviously many atheists do not believe in God, but a lot of them believe in religion.
And he he refers to an atheist philosopher named John Gray that we'll refer to as 7 types of atheism.
7 types of atheism.
So we're not making this up.
No, that's right. But he makes a really good point, which is for centuries, you could argue for millennia, and still today in some Eastern countries, it's illegal to be an atheist.
That's right.
So people hid their atheism.
Yes.
You don't necessarily know. You're like, why don't we know more of it? Well, they're hiding because it's either a bad idea or their life is in danger.
Right. And it's both directions on that particular issue. Some are you have to be atheist / communist, and many are you have to be Muslim. So he pointed out many Christians or so-called Christians in the Middle Ages pretended to believe in order to avoid arrest, censure, or even death. And today, even in Muslim-majority countries, atheism is strongly scandalized and even criminalized. Yes, there are laws against practicing those kinds of things in many countries.
Nonetheless, he argues every world religion that we've covered has atheists in them. We've covered all of these.
Yeah.
Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Sikhism, Confucianism, Taoism, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. He says they exist in every one of these world religions.
So world religions that require a belief in a personal, knowable, and omniscient God are the exception.
Right. So technically those are, by definition, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, the Abrahamic monotheistic faiths.
Yes.
But even there, you have people who are atheists.
Yeah.
But particularly the Chinese and Indian religions that we've covered, they don't require that kind of belief.
Right. So there's plenty of room for that. Interestingly, and you may know this, but a high percentage of Jews are actually atheists. They emphasize the ritual practice and the cultural identity, but not the creeds and beliefs as we would understand what Jews believe as a monotheistic religion believes in a personal, knowable, omniscient God, like you said. Yeah.
So he as he concludes his chapter, he says, so is atheism then actually a religion?
Yes.
And I was wondering where he's going to go with that. So he says, well, on the one hand, many of these famous new atheists like Dawkins, Hawking, they glorify science, the physical, the material, the natural, glorify it in a way that looks like it's religious. But But if we define religion more narrowly, he says define beliefs, worship practices, scriptures, hierarchies, bylaws, moral codes, holy sites, then no. Atheism doesn't really fit into that category.
Sure.
That's what he says.
I would say in terms of what he is studying and what we usually call a religion, sure, of course.
Sure.
But would we say that bowing down at the ism of anything other than a formal traditional religion as we think about it isn't also itself religious practice? Because they do things. They read the same scriptures and books. Mm-hmm. There are super fancy, wonderful, well-known people whose, what's it called, an R index, H index, I think it's called, who have super high H indexes where their journal articles are shared by others and reprinted.
Mm-hmm.
So you can see
common scriptures.
They have common scriptures. They definitely have ways that they know who is best and not. Like they're literally looking at those kinds of measurements.
Their worldview guides everything they do.
Everything.
They're totally committed to it.
Mm-hmm.
They try to convert others to it.
Absolutely.
I mean, you can make a lot of parallels with religion.
Yeah, you could. And people have actually written a number of books like that. But I understand what he means.
Right.
And for our purposes here, it's better to say that many atheists are religious,
right,
but that it is not itself a religion because it's not probably, there's not a structure above it or people that are trying to. Now, I think that's changing. I think it's increasingly the case. And so if he writes this book in another 100 years, it may be entirely different.
Yeah.
For what it's worth. But yeah.
I hope that was helpful for me, Scott. I hope it's helpful for our listeners. Yes, in some ways it is like a religion. No, in other ways it's not. Think about it.
Yep.
Yeah. Yep. All right. So point of contact.
Lots of those.
Yeah. We always end with, okay, how do we interact with atheists and atheism?
And we get here quicker than most others.
We do.
There aren't.
Because there's less specified beliefs and worship practices.
Exactly.
Yeah. So we've reached this point sooner in our discussion today, but we're going to talk for a little bit about a few things. We've said it several times now that many of these new atheists are very anti-religion and particularly anti-Christian.
Yes.
Saying things like it poisons everything and it's the cause of all the hate and violence in the world. Yep. It's really broad, sweeping statements. And so the Gospel Coalition has an article that says it's called 5 Statistics That Reveal Christianity is Good for the World. And we thought it would be helpful to walk through. Actually, there's 6 things because at the end of their article, they list a few other things. But we're going to list some things that you may hear as a cultural narrative where Christianity is a problem. But actually, if you go to this article, they have statistics. You can get the actual data behind it.
Actual numbers.
Yes. So let's talk about let's debunk some of these cultural narratives, cultural ideas that are anti-Christian that are actually not true.
Yeah. One very popular one that a lot of people have heard is Christians aren't really pro-life. They're just pro-birth.
Yeah, you'll hear this a lot.
A lot. It's happening in our political season currently, big time, coming up to an election, which is happening as of this recording today.
Yeah. But this is the argument that you only care that they're born, and after that, you don't care anything about them.
That's right. You're not the womb to tomb people you say that you are. You're just talking about getting babies born. You're just pro-life, you're just pro-birth, not pro-life.
Right. And the reality is that's not true.
Not even remotely close. In fact, it's just the opposite.
Right.
Christians have established almost every single one of the pregnancy resource centers, used to be called crisis pregnancy centers, pregnancy resource centers, to care for the entire process. A mother and
not just the birth.
And I'm on the board of one right now in our current community that has a place where they live and they get job training. They
education.
Help them with resumes. They help them get schooling. They help them with daycare, all the in addition to the other practical material things that are obviously needed.
Right.
There used to be 3, now I think it's maybe even more, 3 pregnancy resource centers for every 1 abortion mill in the country. I think it's actually more than that now, but just to make the point.
Yeah. These are started by Christians.
Yeah.
And countless child sponsorship programs. Again, they're started by Christians.
There are not atheist pregnancy resource centers and foster care and adoption organizations. There just aren't.
Right.
Like, have you ever heard of one?
Right.
Does one exist? Maybe.
Yeah.
But that...
Yeah. All right, so let's be clear on that no, that we don't just care about the child being born.
Have you ever heard of a church that doesn't give some of its giving and tithing and offerings to something like homeless shelters, food banks? There are half a dozen churches around here that I can think of off the top of my head that have started thrift stores as places that help people get anything that you could need for normal life at an incredibly reduced rate.
Yeah.
Again, there aren't atheistic homeless shelters and food banks and things like that.
And even to point out here, the adoption rate among practicing Christians is more than double that of the average U.S. household. Mm-hmm. Christians adopt children.
Which means that they end up putting hundreds of thousands of dollars per kid into that kid on average.
Yeah. I just think it's important that that's the first cultural narrative myth out there. No, Christians are not just pro-birth.
Right.
We are very much pro-person.
Mm-hmm. And pro-life at the end of life.
Right. At the end of life. That's exactly right. We didn't even cover that.
Yeah. There are lots of other things we could have said about all that, but we need to move on apparently. Number 2, Christians are sexually repressive and anti-sex, creating a toxic purity culture. This is more and more common.
Yeah, the idea of a purity culture is a negative thing.
Yeah.
Makes everyone just end up being anti-sex. And I'm sure there are experiences out there where people have come in as adults with poor views on sex that are not healthy and biblical.
Sure.
But
there is such a thing as unhealthy, let's just say unhealthy legalistic ways of thinking about
that exists. That exists.
That happens for sure.
But the data points out that church-going conservative Christians actually have the most fulfilling sex lives in the U.S.
I would like to say that I am one of those. I'm a testament to that being true.
I will. Because covenant marriage, this is the article from Gospel Coalition.
Oh, you mean covenant marriage, the thing that we're saying they should be growing into and having
covenant marriage creates a relational dynamic, I'm quoting, filled with the kind of passion the world wants us to think is produced only by liberation from Scripture's outdated sexual mores. No, that comes from a Christian, a heterosexual, committed, covenant, lifelong marriage. That produces that environment.
For sure. Yes. The nowadays it's cool to say you're sex positive, or like, you're very open and liberated about how your sexuality should be lived, born out, chosen, allowed to go whichever way. However, as it turns out, biblical, scriptural, God's design ways of thinking about the whole thing actually produce better statistically sex lives, as we've said it. Yeah.
Again, go to this article, and they have the data to back it up. Mm-hmm. It's not just making claims.
Yeah.
All right, point 3.
Christianity is emotionally repressive. We've just talked about being sexually repressive. Now this is emotionally repressive. So it's bad for your mental health.
Right. Again, these are narratives in our culture today. Mm-hmm. So some are arguing here the church has a negative impact on the mental health of those who are part of it.
And I understand why people think this, because we say this, you should not do this. You should not do this. You should do this. You should do this, as an outgrowth of
there's
God's holiness.
There's wrong.
Right.
If you do these things, you're hurting yourself. You're making bad decisions. Yes. Mm-hmm. However, the data overwhelmingly points out that church attendance is correlated with, why don't you list these things?
Less depression, less suicide, less emotional pain medication or medicators.
Like
less
smoking,
emotional pain medicators,
substance abuse, things people mask it with.
Yes. So less depression, less suicide, less emotional pain medicators, greater social support, greater meaning in life, greater life satisfaction, more volunteering, greater civic engagement, and children more likely to grow up happy. That's 14, I think.
That's good stuff.
Yeah.
In fact, according to the Washington Times, and I think people have heard this or beginning to hear it, regular churchgoers were the only segment of the population whose mental health improved during the pandemic year of 2020.
I've heard this.
Yeah, Washington Times reported it.
And of all the places.
Right. We're not going to Christianity Today. This is the Washington Times.
This is Washington Times, Post,
right,
New York Times, LA Times. Should I keep
so Christianity is not bad for your mental health. Today. It's just the opposite.
Yeah. I think I said 14. I was counting wrong. It's 9.
It's still a lot.
3, 4, 7, 8, 9. Yes. I was going 1 through 4 instead of adding the 5th. I don't know how to count. So number 4, Christians don't care about the poor. They only care about political power. I hear this a lot. I hear this a lot.
Yeah. Christians are cast as being anti-poor. The argument is their truth claims are just power plays. It's a voting bloc protecting its power and privilege at the expense of the powerless and the underprivileged. That's
Which is
the
a
claim.
modern form of atheistic, communistic, Marxist thinking about what the world is and how it works.
That's right.
Yeah. So it's all just power play, and we hate the poor because it's about us keeping what we know we want.
Our position, our status.
Our privilege, position, power, status, yes.
Yeah.
However, statistically, again, these are all, and I'm glad you said that earlier, because yes, this is studied. People who pray daily and regularly, attend church significantly, outpace their irreligious neighbors in generosity to the poor, both with time and money. That's an interesting and so long story short, Christian political theory and thinking talks about how God's created the world in a way so that, long story short, it has the freedom for his people to do what is the outgrowth of knowing they have love and grace from him. So that is statistically borne out here, that people who pray daily and regularly attend church significantly outpace the irreligious neighbors in generosity to the poor, both with time and money. Frankly, we see that all over the place when you put your eyes to the ground in any community. Now, are there other organizations that are funded by federal things, et cetera, stuff like that? Well, yes, of course. But on the ground level, overwhelmingly, it is exactly what we've just said there.
Yeah. I know my wife and I have a significant portion of our budget that we have set aside to give to the poor.
Yes.
In addition to the local church.
Yes.
This is outside what we give to the church.
Yes.
We give to the poor.
And what you've just said, we are not going to stand in front of people saying, hey, this is what we do all the time to give to the poor. It's just not going to happen. We don't do that. In fact, we have done the same kind of thing on a regular basis in some ways that nobody knows about.
Right.
Little kingdom fund thing in our budget where it's just like, hey, whatever comes up, this is happening all the time for the last almost 30 years of our marriage.
Yeah. And we're not saying the amounts. We're not saying anything like that because we're not trying to. That's not the point.
It's millions in our case, but I
understand that.
Yeah.
I understand.
It's fine for you.
The point is, we aren't just saying these things. We live these things. We believe these things. And it's motivated from the generosity of God toward us.
Right.
That's what does it.
Absolutely. Keeping people in your home.
Yep.
Helping people. There are a couple things going on right now with people I know downtown that I've been involved with for literally years, but it's not worth
Right. We're not going to give specifics, right?
Yeah.
All right, number 5, cultural myth. Christianity is gender oppressive, a tool of the abusive patriarchy, and it creates toxic relationships for women.
Yes.
Now,
very commonly talked about today.
Yeah.
And like we said about, there was something up here where it's, toxic purity culture. Have there been examples of legalism or people who, for the purpose of maintaining power and privilege, hurt other people? Absolutely.
Of course.
And that's the case here.
Right.
It's been true of some churches that have not protected women in this case, for example.
But the article points out this is not a failure of our theology.
Correct.
Our theology doesn't support that.
That's right.
It's sinfulness and a failure to live up to our own understanding and beliefs.
Yes. In fact, our theology says, our complementarian theology says, as it relates to some of this exact issue, our role is to ensure that the protection does happen.
That's right. Yeah, I love how Piper talks about in God's design, man and woman are two God-entranced beings of equal dignity and worth who are brought together for God's purposes to find fulfillment and joy. Like that's what it's supposed to be.
Sure.
So but again, the article points out the statistics show church attendance still yields the most enjoyable and least abusive relationships for women. It's the best. In fact, the article says theologically conservative, like our church, gender traditional, church attending women are in the category of the happiest relationships with the least abuse in the country. That's what the stats show.
Nice.
Yeah.
And then finally,
those were 5. They added this at the end. We just call it 0.6.
Christianity changes people
for good.
Meaning this is this is not the cultural narrative that we're correcting with studies and statistics. This is what Christianity does, as opposed to the cultural narrative. It changes people. Yeah. The more one attends church, the less likely that person is to commit a major crime. Children raised in church-going households are less likely to be depressed, less likely to use drugs, less likely to engage in sexual activity outside of marriage. Christian marriages are 35% less likely to end in divorce.
Yeah, so people don't believe that.
I'm glad that's mentioned because there's this common thing that's been going on. It's actually an abuse of the data,
right?
And being not careful with it, and it's been that way actually for the last 30 years, misusing the data. But Christian marriages are 35% less likely to end in divorce. One study even suggests that church attendance can add up to 7 years to your life.
Yeah, with wise decisions.
If you were just putting out all the data.
Yeah. Yeah. If you were a being from another planet, an alien, and you came and you looked just at the data, you would say, this is the best resource these beings have for thriving.
Yes.
It is Christianity.
What do you know? God's designed for human flourishing, and that's for the common good, Christian or not.
Yeah.
Is how it works.
So again, that article, if you want to look it up, is 5 statistics reveal Christianity is good for the world, Gospel Coalition.
Do you believe in aliens, Mark?
Let's move on.
Arguments for the existence of God.
Okay, so again, that we thought it was important to cover that because a lot of these new atheists are more virulent against Christianity.
For sure.
So we debunked those cultural myths, but there are actually good arguments for the existence of God. And one of the great resources out there today is William Lane Craig. And you may not agree with everything he says, but he has been a great help and a resource for the church.
Yeah, I certainly don't, because he doesn't understand Reformed theology like at all, but carry on.
Well, that's what I'm saying. There's things you may not agree with. But as an
his
apologist...
exegesis on Romans is terrible, but carry on.
As an apologist, he's been very, very helpful.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
He is a force.
Oh, he is. And he deals with the Dawkins and the others
Bro
head
knows his stuff.
Yeah,
beyond any...
And he's fun to listen to. He gets animated about these things.
I mean, he can be fun, sure. Okay, fun-ish.
So look up William Lane Craig, 5 Arguments for God. That's another Gospel Coalition article, but it has a link in it at the top to a 30-page PDF that he put out there.
So we're going to just start reading.
Right. No. But we're going to mention his 5 main arguments for the existence of God. And if you want the details, go to that PDF that's in that article where I liked it because he says, now Dawkins says this in response to this.
Yes, he has the to and fro,
and
the back and forth in this.
Right. He'll say, well, here's the counter argument, but here's how I don't think that holds weight. So he deals, if you're thinking, but what does the other side say? He deals with that very authentically.
Yeah.
So again, Dr. William Lane Craig is the research professor of philosophy at Talbot School of Theology in La Mirada, California. So let's talk about these 5 arguments.
We'll talk about the cosmological argument from contingency.
We're not going to cover in depth.
No, we're not. The Kalam cosmological argument based on the beginning of the universe. That is the most complex of these and would take 3 episodes. Number 3, the moral argument based upon objective moral values and duties. Number 4, the teleological argument from fine-tuning.
We'll talk a little more about that one.
And 5, the ontological argument from the possibility of God's existence to his actuality. These are the classic arguments for the existence of God. And I'm glad we're covering these because I remember hearing some of these and reading some of these things growing up. And I think I always took for granted, these are out there and they arguments for why what I believe isn't crazy talk. But I don't think that's remotely as common nowadays, unless perhaps you're, a homeschool kid who's in a conservative Bible-believing Mark and Beth Ann Liebert kind of home, or you go to Providence Academy.
Sure.
So I think this is super helpful. The first one's a cosmological argument from contingency.
Yeah. So again, if you go to the PDF that's linked in that article, there's a quick summary of just a few bullet points of each one of these. We're just going to say these and move on because you got to look this up.
The five.
Yeah, the five.
Yeah. And these, it notes here, this is a logically airtight argument. Yes. There's not a formal logic problem.
Right.
Or informal, but there's not a formal logic problem in terms of how it's put together, the P's and Q's. So number one is everything that exists has an explanation of its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause. We should put that on screen, Charlie. Make sure that gets on screen because it's kind of hard to track with. Everything that exists has an explanation of its existence. Okay? Where it comes from, its beginning. Either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause.
If that's true, then number two, again, this is part of the cosmological argument. If the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God.
Because if everything is in the necessity of its own nature explained or in an external cause, the universe explanation has to be external.
Right.
So that's what this argument is saying.
Right.
Yes. It's not explaining everything about how they get there.
You can read the article.
You can read the rest for that, and there's a lot to it. But if the universe does have an explanation, that explanation is God.
Point three, the universe clearly does exist.
And when we say it's a logically airtight argument,
we mean things like that.
You have to put that in.
You have to put that in logically. If you remember your proofs and things like that, you've got to put these things in.
Yes. It sounds like, why are they even saying that? Of course it exists.
Part of the logic.
It's self-evident.
Right.
Well, logically, you have to.
Right. So then two therefores that come out of this.
Yes. Therefore, number four, the universe has an explanation of its existence.
That's from points 1 and 3.
Yeah. And then therefore the explanation of the universe's existence is God.
From
It
points 2 and
sounds
4.
simplistic.
Right.
In this form.
Right.
Because it doesn't tell you why it has to be an external cause.
Right.
It doesn't tell you anything about that existence in this logical form. But read the article, and there's a lot that explains why those things are not just plausible,
right,
but warranted.
Right. Necessary.
Yes. And he would say more than even warranted.
Right.
Yes.
And again, he'll interact with Dawkins' response to that. All right, the second is the Kalam cosmological argument based on the beginning of the universe. We'll break it down into very simple 3 points, but then you have to dig into it. So everything that begins to exist has a cause.
Yes.
That's point 1.
Point 2 is the universe began to exist.
And everyone sees this. They used to think the universe was eternal.
Yes.
But now everyone says, no, it has a point where it began.
Right.
So 3, therefore, the universe has a cause.
And that's easy to understand.
That part you can say.
Yes.
Okay. Again,
which is to say, again, it is logically airtight.
Right.
There's nothing wrong with the formal argument.
No.
And actually, all philosophers and atheists concede all that.
Yeah.
That's not where the argument is remotely.
Right.
It's in the details of what does the beginning of the universe mean and how do we know? And yeah.
All right. Third is the moral argument based on moral values and duties. Again, 3 points here. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist.
Number 2, objective moral values and duties do exist.
3, therefore, God exists.
Yes. And again, logically airtight. The details are where the argument happens. We talked at some length about this with the C.S. Lewis Mere Christianity thing, which is, and there are other versions of arguments it makes, but it's kind of one big, long moral argument being made in Mere Christianity. We have a sense of moral right and wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
All right. Number 4 is the teleological argument from fine-tuning.
Yeah.
So 3 sub-points here. The fine-tuning of the universe is due to either physical necessity, chance, or design. Those are the only 3 options.
Yes. It is not due to physical necessity or chance.
And again, read the article for why.
Yes, and a lot of people would say it is due to chance. Of course it's due to chance. Yeah, sure.
Third, therefore, the only thing left, it is due to design.
Yes.
Now, this one specifically, if you listen to the New Atheists, they will say this one carries the most weight. I have watched their videos where they sit around discussing, and they say, you cannot just dismiss this one out of hand.
Right, because they know the evidence well.
Right. So you and I are not familiar with what is this fine-tuning that we're talking about. So we want to direct you to a video link we can put in YouTube in here. Go to Dr. Craig Videos. That's a YouTube channel. Mm-hmm. And it's called The Fine-Tuning of the Universe. It's just 6 minutes, but it will list what are these physical, like in the science of physics and everything else, what are these things that are required to exist, for life to exist?
Yes, it's the statistical analyses of the argumentation for just DNA.
Right.
We're not even talking about everything else.
No.
Just DNA is so many zeros you can't possibly make it happen. It's just the chance element is so far off the table that all mathematicians say, okay, well, technically, is there a chance? Not really.
Yeah, not really. So I'll just list some of these things. The Higgs vacuum expectation value. Again, I don't understand these. I'm just saying scientists say these things are required. The mass of up, down, and strange quark. The mass of electron and neutrinos. The electromagnetism. Coupling constant. The strong nuclear force coupling constant. The cosmological constant. The scalar fluctuation amplitude Q. The baryon dark matter mass per photon. The entropy of the universe. Again, the number of, I don't remember what this last one was, the number of space-time dimensions. Okay. I don't understand what these things are.
I do. Would you like me to explain them?
I would appreciate that. So but please do look up The Fine-Tuning of the Universe by Dr. Craig Videos, or go to Gavin Ortland, Truth Unites, another YouTube subscription, where he says fine-tuning is simply a good argument. And he shows that video and then explains it and why it matters.
Very helpful.
Yeah, but I'm pointing this out because I've literally watched the videos where they sit around and they say, as an atheist, you can't just dismiss this out of hand.
Right.
It carries some weight.
It exists. We know these things are true. What's the explanation for these many factors? And the things that you named and listed there, I'm glad you named them all, because oftentimes people will talk about fine-tuning as, like, for example, just cosmological constants.
No.
Now, that is definitely one of the big ones.
It's one of them.
That's easy to explain and understand.
Right.
And I think that's why it's hearkened to too often. But there are quite a few of them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Things beyond
dark energy,
our
man.
pay grade. So
Higgs boson, blah, 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 blah.
All right. So the fifth argument that Dr. Craig provides is called the ontological argument from the possibility of God's existence to his actuality.
This is one of my favorites, even though it's the hardest to understand and explain.
We
probably shouldn't spend too much time.
Just 6 points. Number one, it is possible that a maximally great being exists. It's possible.
Yes. And actually, one of the things that's going to be slightly difficult to understand in this is, like all of the rest of them, it actually is an airtight, formal argument.
Right.
It's logically an airtight argument. There's nothing wrong with it. Now, this is the one that people have philosophically kind of said, but actually, it's Alvin Plantinga.
Yes.
Is
everybody knows that name if you research
everybody in
this.
philosophy knows this name.
Yes.
Especially with the ontological argument.
Yeah, Christian.
Yes. So it is airtight, even though it's a little bit hard to kind of track with some of it. So you just said, number one, it is possible that a maximally great being exists. Number two, if it is possible that a maximally great being exists, then a maximally great being exists in some possible world.
Number three, if a maximally great being exists in some possible world, then it exists in every possible world. Keep going.
If a maximally great being exists in every possible world, then it exists in the actual world.
If a maximally great being exists in the actual world, then a maximally great being exists.
Therefore, a maximally great being exists.
Yeah, I love logic. It's fun. But again, all of this comes from that article, William Lane Craig, 5 Arguments for God, Gospel Coalition, top paragraph. Click on the PDF, 30 pages, walks through each one of these with the counter arguments from Dr. Dennett and Dawkins and others. But very, very helpful.
Yes. And the ontological argument with maximally great being, traditionally, it's that being than which nothing greater can exist.
Right.
And there's some definition to all that in there, but it's we threw out that term a bunch of times.
Yeah.
That's the traditional concept.
And you mentioned Alvin Plant INGA.
Yes.
Great resource if you want to get. I've read some of his work, but again, if you want something more at the layman's level, YouTube video very helpful. Gavin Ortlund, Truth Unites, Dr. Craig videos, extremely helpful on this topic. In fact, Gavin Ortlund says in the video about this fine-tuning argument, he says, look, the truth is there is no worldview on the market that is entirely rational or explicable in terms of observable physical causes. The simple fact is our world is not explainable by what we can see and by what we can measure.
Yes.
And that's just true.
And that first sentence, at first, Christians especially, might listen to that and say, well, that's not good. There's no worldview on the market that's entirely rational and explicable in terms of observable physical causes. That's a problem. Not as much as it sounds.
Right.
The simple fact that our world is not explainable by what we can see and what we can measure
means you have to go elsewhere.
Right.
Out of the realm of science.
Yes. And one of the things, it's slightly simplistic, but because of Thomas Kuhn and others, I stand by it. Science is inherently descriptive.
Mm-hmm.
That's what it is.
That's what it does.
It doesn't create. It tells what is there.
Right.
Which is to say, the simple fact is our world is not explainable by what we can see and measure.
An easy way to think of it is science cannot tell you why the world exists.
Absolutely.
That is not in its realm. Why the world exists is not in the realm of science.
Which is why we're saying you should look at Gavin Ortlund's book called Why God Makes Sense in a World That Doesn't.
Yeah, I haven't read it yet. I would like to get it. This is the next book I think I'm going to order. Gavin Ortlund, Why God Makes Sense in a World That Doesn't. Yeah. As we finish up here, just Dr. Cooper presents what he calls the dodecagram. He coined this. It's 12 ways that people connect to God, or that you can say everyone's experience has this in common. That points to something beyond them. It points to a God behind it. Mm-hmm. And he just puts it in terms of 6 areas: head, heart, core, limbs, soul, and spirit, with 2 things under each. So you come up with 12. I just think it's helpful if we note these things that are common to the human experience that point to something beyond us.
Yeah. So the first is head, and the 2 breakdowns of that are rational and secularist.
Right. Rational is our ability to think. Why can we think?
Yes.
It points to something beyond us.
And a secularist is that our tendency would be to nurture communities.
Yeah, he says, why do we nurture communities? Again, points to something beyond us.
Yeah.
What he calls heart is naturalist and artist. Naturalist is just the nature around us. You look at the nature around us, points to something greater. Artist is our inclination toward creating things. Why do we have a creative bent?
Well, because we're made in God's image.
Right.
Yeah. But that is just to make the connection between Christians to understand that. The third is core. Scripturalist refers to the Bible itself.
Right.
And then a traditionalist way of connecting with God is through church history.
Right. So those are legitimate things.
Yeah.
Fourth, he calls limbs. He calls this activist and altruist. Activist is our desire to advocate for others. Why do we do that? Why do we advocate for others? And altruist is our desire to serve others. Why do we find it in ourselves to advocate for others and serve others? God.
Yeah. In our soul, there is the perfectionist desire to live morally upright. Right.
Everybody wants to. They want to live by a standard and meet it.
Yeah. And ritualist, our desire to form religions to promote worship. That's common throughout 100% of history.
Yes, all cultures do that.
Yes.
And lastly, the 6th category, called spirit, is made up of mysticist and supernaturalist. So mysticist is our natural compulsion to pray. There are no atheists in foxholes.
That's right.
People pray. Why? And supernaturalist is our inherent search for meaning in the universe. Why do we search for meaning?
Yeah.
So I thought those were helpful. He calls it the dodecagram, 6 ways to 12 total. But his point is well made. All of us experience these things. Why?
Yeah. Yeah. It's an explanation that, just as we've said, points towards
something beyond.
Yes, a capital G God.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yep.
Well, hope that's helpful.
Good stuff.
Nuns is next.
Cool.